Thank you very much. Question 5. This question is going to be responded to by Deborah and Tina. The question is, what else can we do to ensure that low-income families maximize the benefits available to them? Deborah?
Sometimes low-income families don't realize what they might qualify for. So a campaign on awareness for consumers, communication on benefits and services are not often advertised in easy to understand or user-friendly manner. And so families may not know what's available to them. So I believe that for us as a community, first we have to know what services are available to low-income families in order to be able to assist the low-income families. Many community organizations that work with low-income families are unaware. They may be unaware, for example, of a program that we administer. It's called the Prevention, Retention, Contingency, or PRC program. And it's a program that's designed to provide work supports and other services to help low-income parents overcome immediate barriers to employment. It's funded through the TANF program. Other community agencies that provide services for low-income working families may not be aware of that. And Job and Family Services may not be aware of services that the other community organizations provide. So it'll take, what it will take is a multifaceted approach. First of all, I believe in order to help our families maximize the benefits that are available to them, we have to understand their needs, not through our eyes, but through their eyes. Because what we say they might need might not be what they believe they need. I believe that we could benefit from having information outreach sessions, both for the families, for the community partners. We can educate our staff in the various agencies about the community services that exist for low-income families. Important to note, and I think I mentioned this early, is to get the customer engaged. So conducting family focus groups where they can tell us what they believe they need, because we can't decide what anybody needs except for ourselves. We can look at creating an enhanced referral process. But more important than that, and I believe I mentioned this earlier, is to really be able to track the progress of our families. So they're receiving services throughout our community, but I don't know that we have a system wherein we can tell when a change was made in their lives.
Thank you, Deborah. Tina?
Thanks. You know, well, I think a lot of progress is being made in kind of destigmatizing the whole welfare kind of mentality or process. I still, I like to think about the word benefits, you know, or making benefits available. I like to think about it more of the presentation of opportunities available to low-income folks, you know, versus that still is, have you applied for your benefits? Well, have you looked at your opportunities? Just in that word itself changes the concept in which people begin to think about it. I love the idea and the mention of this collaboration process. Being in social services, a lot of times you forget all of the other touches that might have occurred of that one client that's right there presenting in front of you. And many times we still work in silos to where, you know, I'm in the homeless, I'm going to think about homelessness and what is available to you versus looking at what all the other opportunities that exist crossing over into all of these other systems. So I think one of the best things that we could do is to look at some of this cross-training of availability of opportunities that can exist for consumers that are low income versus us saying, well, I can only do this and I'm going to send you here for whatever that could be. Is looking at how to blend that to make it a one-stop social, wherever I happen to land, whether that's in the homeless system, they can tell me what's available to me throughout all of the systems. So somehow being able to cross those silos and be able to share that kind of opportunities or information in a better, seamless way. I also tend to believe that you've heard me talk already a couple of times about this community integration and looking at communities. I've been around a while and I remember the old community centers, and I know they're a thing of the past, but there is still something to be said for going to the client versus having the client come to you. And I know that access through Benefit Bank and technology has certainly alleviated some of that, but there's still the process in which to even log in, get that kind of information, and it's a very black answer, yes, no, where the human touch, and particularly it's something so personal, would go a long way. Particularly when it's not so black and white, and I have a question, but how do I talk into that computer to get the answer back to me? So again, I go back to looking at ways in which we can integrate more of those services into communities or where they are at versus waiting for them to come to you. And again, when we wait, that's when things get worse. And we say we don't know how people know what's available to them. Again, I think that sharing of information through social services in general would go a long way at being able to make that kind of information accessible to the consumer that's right there in front of you versus, again, making you go to another organization. So again, I think the biggest piece to this is that we look at integrating where you're at, taking it 2 steps forward, which means backwards and catching you earlier, and making all of us more generalist and less specialist, and knowing I only work with homeless, I don't know these kinds of things. So certainly some cross-training would be beneficial, and I know I think that's probably one of the big key pieces we could do.
Thank you.
Can I hop on to this real quick? Or is that not allowed?
Well, if it's very quick, because
I
we've got a
promise.
couple of minutes.
So I just want to underscore that I think peer navigators are key to everything that was talked about here, is that there are some of our clients who are capable of serving the role of crossing those silos, and they know it already because they've lived it, and I think that they could share that perspective.
Okay, and this is probably a good time for me to say that we have a couple of more questions for the panelists, and then we have a summary question. And that may be a good time for the rest of you to kind of summarize for the audience what things you might stop, that you might change, or you might add to what we're currently doing in the community. That will be your last question, but I wanted to give you a chance to reflect on that a little bit as we go through the next 2 questions. And you may want to expound on it then.
Thank you.
Okay. So the next question is question 6, and it's what else can we do to reduce behavioral health gaps for those at risk of housing loss and homelessness? And Tina, we're going to come back to you.
Well, again, there's a theme coming from me. I also believe that it's critical that organizations cross over and share information in a way that is really in the best interest of the client. Is first and foremost one of the things that I think would be critical to making sure that whatever system you're in, you understand that this client can be served in multiple systems, and recognizing how do we share that information, being very sensitive to the confidentiality of something like a behavioral health gap. But I think it's very, very important that we all work kind of outside of our purview to really prevent homelessness with a population that truly is probably one of the hardest to serve. And once we've been successful in housing placement with a subpopulation of people with behavioral health, you certainly want to maintain their housing. There is a model that that exists right now. It's called the ACT model, which is the Assertive Community Treatment model, that I think many times is most synonymous with a severe and persistently mentally ill person, and not necessarily with a general mental health or a less severe diagnosis. That the concept is wrapping an entire team of professionals with very distinct disciplines, whether it's a psychiatrist or an RN, a case manager, and so forth. The model itself is what I like best, is really wrapping around a real collaborative, cohesive team that has its own disciplines and its own focus, whether that's an organization that says, I'm about housing or homelessness prevention, I can get services. I'm a community mental health worker, I can get you the mental health work that you need. I am your jobs and family services worker. And much different in terms of looking at what are the additional kinds of things that you can bring to the table versus just focusing on the behavioral health of that. Granted, I think that behavioral health person, part of that team, is a critical kind of model. So that it's not your client, my client, or somebody's, it's a team approach, and that team is just a little different than the traditional ACT model of a doctor, psychiatrist, or so forth, but it's service providers wrapping themselves around there and offering those very distinct disciplines to prevent that housing loss. And particularly to be there before they're in crisis, whether that's a mental health crisis or a housing crisis. And we all know that they're kind of synonymous, that at one point the mental health could then cause or lead to the homelessness issues and so forth. So how can this team, this collective team, that really is kind of outside of the normal. We typically look at mental health agencies doing their piece and homeless services agencies doing theirs. How could we blend those together to create this really unique team that's really focused on housing stability?
Thank you, Tina. Jennifer?
Yeah, I want to piggyback on what Tina mentioned. I think that those wraparound services are imperative to preventing homelessness for some individuals that are having those struggles. I know within our families, we serve over 3,000 families, that we have individuals within our sites that have some mental health issues, and it really becomes a struggle for us because obviously we have families within those sites that there might be some inappropriate interaction. And so I think if we can build a collaborative effort that would include an education piece for some of those other agencies that are tangentially kind of working with individuals who might have some mental health issues, I think that would go a long way to be able to have that communication. Again, not wanting to violate any kind of confidentiality information about the client, but really maybe to put together some type of protocol or a step-by-step assessment that a layperson could do with an individual working in conjunction with their service provider.
Thank you, Jennifer. Jim?
So I'm just going to second everything that they said. And the one thing that I think, again, we have to change the way that we think and the way we verbalize these things. So I've always used the whole idea of wraparound services. That's the paradigm that I think in. But I was recently introduced to the whole concept of that, well, wraparound is one thing, but really completion of care is what we're talking about, because if we don't complete the cycle, then the person is going to stumble again. And this really is a completion of what we started. It's not just wrapping around and grabbing this, but we can anticipate usually when we have someone that we're working with that they are going to have a broad range of needs. Particularly dealing with somebody who has mental health issues. They are very likely, as a result of a mental health issue, to then be at risk for eviction and or homelessness. And so when they begin to have an episode, we as a system should be able to anticipate that they may very well likely encounter an eviction challenge or a homelessness situation. And so engaging at the front to do preventative steps rather sorry, Tina. As Tina said a couple of times, I think we need to be more proactive in that way, particularly with folks who fit a particular channel that we've seen repeated in multiple different clients with multiple different life circumstances.
Thank you. So now we are down to question number 7, and this is a question that's going to be answered by each of the panelists. The question is, what is the rule or regulation you would eliminate today if you could, and what simple change could it make? How would it impact any of the 3 focus areas: education and life skills, health and safety, income and stability? And I think for this question, because all of you will answer, we will start with Jennifer and work our way back down to Deborah.
Within the Housing Authority, we're very highly regulated. Everything we do has a regulation associated with it. And so what is becoming apparent, especially now, we're gearing up for our development plan. The one regulation is how we acquire property, and that set of regulations. Many times it slows us down. We can't react to market changes. If we see a property we want to purchase, we can't move quickly on it. Many of our funds, and I don't want to bore you with our funding scheme because it is very boring, but we do have some money. Most of our money is federalized. And so that comes under a special, stricter scrutiny in regards to how we spend the money. So because of this regulation, we used some of our defederalized money, some of our reserves, to go out and purchase some property. And we had to do that because we had to act quickly. And we purchased some properties in Kettering, again, following that plan to decentralize. So long story short, I would do away with the set of regulations that require us to seek prior approval from HUD, which many times takes 8 to 9 months.
Thank you. Tina?
Well, being a homeless service provider, first and foremost, I'd eliminate all of her regulations. So,
Yes.
I mean, if I'm getting to do it, I'm going to do that first. So, but the reality is that we all have multiple funding streams that we have to be very sensitive to and mindful of. The recognition is that the problem is that people don't fit into those perfect regulations, nor does their disaster or their crisis fit into those perfect kind of regulations. So for us, I guess, you know, if I can't remove everybody else's bureaucratic paperwork at Job and Family Services and GDPM, then I guess the thing that we would look for is this kind of flexibility that allows us to say, this is unique to this particular person, whatever that is, and I can assist you, which is outside of the norm of your regulations or of any other regulations. It allows you to really serve the person where they are at. We recognize that, and I'll use the example of people that come into the shelter. Many times we try to divert them from ever coming in, and that diversion we try to happen very quickly, which we all know that when you try to put somebody into a pot of accessing resources for them, nothing can go quickly. So we've created what we call as this very flexible pot, and really it is the opportunity to say that if I only had this amount of money with the no strings attached, I could truly impact that situation right now for that particular person. And so you know, since I can't remove all the regulations, I guess then I ask for the creation of this flexible spending that allows us to truly address that person in that situation at that particular point. I also do think that there has to be some kind of sensitivity to or mindness of the fact that when people are in need the opportunities presented to them or the benefits that are presented to them, there is a magnitude of bureaucratic paperwork and process that has to go through. If there was a way that we could streamline that to where if it's done once, it's done for multiple parties versus, well, I know you might have done this over here, but I need you to do it here. So I guess if I'm dreaming the dream, it's not necessarily removing that kind of regulation. It is somehow making it more efficient for the person that's in that crisis right then, that allows us to access those services and opportunities or benefits directly without that delay. Because, you know, again, if we weren't able to prevent it 3 steps back, they're presenting now with that crisis and disaster, then let's try to make it as painless and as quick as possible.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So I have 2. A relatively simple change, all things being relative, would be to change zoning laws. We have the ability to shape the housing market throughout the county through the use of our local regulatory policies. Regulations such as zoning policies, land use restrictions, development fees, subdivision design requirements, and building codes help determine whether and where different types of housing can be developed. Exclusionary zoning policies, such as those that ban the development of multifamily housing, duplexes, and manufactured housing, or that require large lots or wide sidewalks, are barriers to the development of affordable housing. Inclusionary zoning and well-designed growth management policies can successfully expand the supply of affordable housing while keeping administrative costs low. Ideally, this would be a regional effort rather than simply removing barriers on a jurisdiction-by-jurisdiction basis. That would allow for a mix of regulatory tools that would increase the supply of affordable multifamily housing while also supporting other regional goals such as open space protection, economic development, and urban revitalization. The second, and I will concede up front, this isn't really a rule or a regulation, but it's a widespread practice that impacts all 3 focus areas. If I could, I would wave that magic wand and eliminate the box that must be checked on most job applications asking if the applicant has a criminal history. Checking this box is a huge barrier to employment right up front that impacts, so it's impacting income, health, housing, all of the areas that we talk about. By eliminating the criminal history question initially, doesn't mean it can't be asked ever, but by eliminating it initially, applicants would be judged solely on their qualifications. Similarly, we could use a criminal relevance matrix that I found some information about that looks, and it could be applied by an outside organization, that really matches which convictions are relevant for particular jobs. For example, if you're gonna have a job that involves driving, maybe you're gonna be a school bus driver, well, a DUI conviction, a driving under the influence would be relevant for that. Jobs working with vulnerable populations, such as children or seniors, you might wanna look at violent crimes to be relevant for that. But really having it be that the criminal conviction is maybe both recent and more importantly relevant rather than right now eliminating sizable percentages of parts of our community from employment. I wanted to mention that both the City of Dayton and Montgomery County have adopted this policy and have banned the box, but if we could have, if you could waive it and have a campaign that private sector employers would do the same thing, I think it would have a tremendous impact.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Keith?
To piggyback on Kathleen for a moment, it's one of the things that I had in my notes, but I strongly agree for men and women to have a livelihood, to live and be stable. it's one of the things, it's somewhat psychological if you are a felon. If you go into a situation to fill out an application, immediately in your mind, you already know that this question is going to be on that application. And largely, many men and women that are coming from institutions throughout the state get frustrated, stressed out. And so the notion is it's easier to just say, forget it. Because how much rejection can I take from an employer? One of the things that was extremely frustrating for me is going to 10 interviews and filling out the application, taking the drug test, and then it goes up to corporate for them to only say, no, thank you. So this is a huge issue for livelihood and improving stability. If that question is never even on an application, to be quite frankly. And I agree that judging a person by their abilities and what they can add to your particular company or your particular group is the more important thing in the first place. It's morally, we tend to judge on what we see. But if we kind of put that aside and judge people based on their abilities, what can they do? What can they add? How can they provide value to you or to your establishment? So I think that that's huge. I think also in terms of welfare, kind of eliminating some things to where welfare may say, in order to be on welfare, you can only earn this amount of money. And this amount of money may be well below the poverty level. So rather than discourage, kind of coupled with the two, welfare and earning, reward it. Don't take it away and say you can't do this, but reward it with, you have a part-time job. Okay, so you're still able to receive this, or you have a full-time job that is still below the poverty line. Okay, you're still able to receive this. So, I think we should, again, think outside of the box on a lot of issues that pertain to welfare and pertain to men and women coming home from prison.
Thank you. Thank you. Jim?
So I too, up front, will admit that this may not be a rule or regulation, but I think it is a protocol or a tenet or a principle that we've all accepted, particularly here in the Miami Valley. And that is that we won't help keep you housed until you hit a crisis. And I've referenced this before. There's no real solid assistance for people who are facing losing their housing until they're almost out the door already. I think there needs to be a priority set and funding found to provide money to an existing agency or creating a new agency that is focused on keeping people housed and providing interventions that occur early enough to keep individuals or families housed. So if somebody's going to be facing an eviction or somebody's having challenges paying their rent, they can go to that agency and secure coordinated services, not have to wait until they've been served with an eviction notice when we only have one agency that is already struggling to have sufficient funding to be able to help all those folks. I think that by doing that, we can ensure that people have the foundation that they need to cross all three of the focus areas to ensure they have better education, better life skills, health and safety, and income stability. It's very difficult to achieve any of those things, not impossible, but very difficult if you're homeless. So.
Thank you. Thank you. Deborah?
A lot of what I would say has already been said, but I would add that I think it's one regulation that I would change would be the immediate termination of benefits that customers receive, such as the child care or the food assistance or the medical assistance or the ability to get financial assistance to send their children to college, or housing assistance because they received a job that put them minimally over the poverty level. Studies have shown that it takes a little while to adjust to having income when you haven't had it. And there are skills that have to be learned in order to maintain. So just having a job doesn't mean you come out of poverty, because part of poverty is the thought process. So we've seen, and you've probably seen and heard, where persons have, for example, won the lottery and won lots of money. And you would think by that they could sustain themselves, but then you find after a short time that money is gone, and then the request for benefits, is there. So one thing that I would change would be the immediate drop off. So I would increase the income standard guidelines for all of those programs, and that it would be staggered based on the progress of the individual towards self-sufficiency.
So we're down to our last question now, and this is a question where we're asking you to, in summary, based on everything you've heard today, in addition to the need for more funding, because everybody needs more funding, right? What would you stop, change, or add to what we're currently doing in the community today? And I'm going to begin this one with Kathleen, and I'm going to select the order in which I ask you to respond.
So as difficult as it would be, we need to stop funding programs and organizations just because we always have, or because we think they are doing good work or they're well-intentioned. Even the best strategies will not succeed if they're not implemented effectively. Policymakers should assess agencies' operating capacity and their ability to build successful partnerships and identify ways to strengthen organization capacity when needed. Clearly defined performance targets that can be measured using data should be established for all strategies to determine their effectiveness. On a different point, we've heard poverty mentioned several times today. We need to change the conversation about poverty in our community, away from a debate between causes versus symptoms, and away from poverty as this huge, unsolvable, amorphous blob that sits in the middle of the room because it is too big to address. The current discussion about poverty is not helpful in figuring out what the problems are and identifying innovative solutions, or in evaluating whether any progress has been made. Mary Jo Bain with the Harvard Kennedy School underscores the need for changes to the way that poverty is conceptualized to allow for a problem-solving protocol that addresses the specific problems that are of concern to a community, that policymakers and community problem solvers can get their heads around, and for which success and failure can be both imagined and measured. For example, there are different problems and characteristics of the households that we group together as poor. There are multi-generational single-parent families, working families who have fallen on hard times for a year or two, or recent immigrants, to name a few, each of which would require different policy and program responses. We need to frame the discussion so that we can establish a consensus on specific strategies that can be implemented and measured.
Thank you, Kathleen, very much. Deborah?
Just to sum up, I think that we have to meet the low-income families where they are. So we have to really be conscious of what works for individuals. I think someone said earlier that what is an issue for one low-income family is not an issue for every low-income family. And we have to meet people where they are and move them from there. Now, the funding and the resources that would be needed for that could be problematic. But I think if we begin by targeting an area or a group and look at that from the customer's perspective, because we can put all kinds of resources before people, but if the mind and the heart doesn't change, then the resources won't be beneficial in the long term.
Thank you. Thank you. Jim?
Well, I'm going to dovetail some on what Kathleen. I think we need to change the paradigm in which we talk about the work that we do with moderate to low income people, and I think we need to change the paradigm with which we think about it. My agency had a lot of experience with folks who, during the foreclosure crisis, and for the majority of those folks that we dealt with, they never saw themselves needing to access the system, as it were, because they, in their own view, felt like they'd achieved home ownership and they were on a wealth building track, and that they would never need food stamps or any of the other benefits or opportunities that are there. And what that underscored for me was that lots of times when I think about moderate to low income or low wage earners, I'm not thinking big enough about who those folks really are. There are so many people who make just over minimum wage, and I think we need to think differently, and we need to encourage a different branding of it. So for instance, we do a lot of job training to get people ready to go out into the job force. What if the one thing that we did as a strategy was teach people that the first line on your resume is that you want to obtain a position that pays a livable wage? Because most of my clients, when I talk to them and I ask them, what do you want? They say, I want a job that pays at least minimum wage. Well, they're setting themselves up for failure, because if all they get is a job that pays minimum wage, even if they're willing to work 50 hours a week, it's not going to be enough. So we need to start framing things to where people understand that they can ask for what it is that they need. They don't really need a job that only pays minimum wage. They need a job that pays a livable wage. And then I think that we need to do a better job, and I've mentioned this before, but I am going to circle back and say, of elevating the people who are taking the opportunities that we have to offer and creating peer advocates and peer mentors and peer navigators. So I think that there are opportunities that we've missed. So there are people who have been in the system. They've received multiple different benefits from multiple different agencies, and they know how to navigate the system. And I think we should capitalize upon that and then create opportunities for them to provide their insight to people who are new to the system and needing to learn it. So for instance, there could be a dialogue group, and it could be built around when they're sitting in the waiting room at the One-Stop Job Center. To get things. We know that there are natural congregate places like laundromats where we could hold these kinds of discussions. There are existing peer groups already around things like diseases. So there are lots of women's support groups for women with breast cancer. Well, a lot of women with breast cancer also have issues around making sure they can feed their family, and we know that women regularly prioritize their needs below those of their children and their family. And so if we can mix those two, and when you're coming to a breast cancer support group, you also can learn about how do I access the system that I need so I can get child care, so that I can afford to go to my oncologist or have the time to go to my oncologist and not miss work and thus lose pay. I think we need to create some of those collaborations, crossovers there.
Thank you, Jim. Jennifer?
Yes, I've learned quite a bit from being a panelist up here with some great ideas and things that are of great importance. But one thing I think is that we need to support policies that give residents of Montgomery County choices. specifically choices in housing and where they live and where they're able to live. And one other thing that I took away from many of the panelists is the need to have the clients involved in the process. And that makes sense because they're the ones that are affected by this. And I think that that was a great point.
Tina?
Well, back to my kind of original theme throughout most of my topics have been, this affordable housing concept with service-enriched, integrating and strengthening communities and looking at the earlier prevention kinds of things are kind of this critical piece to that. I'll echo some of Jim's comments, particularly on this, on his prevention for people that are facing evictions and so forth. In the homeless system, we've been very good about making sure that we're targeting resources to people who are at risk of literal homelessness, almost to the extent of not being able then to provide those resources to people who are facing eviction. That again, if we stay consistent to my theme of 2 or 3 steps before they show up in the homeless system, we have to recognize that eviction, while they might be able to say, yes, I'm not going to end up at the homeless shelter tomorrow, if not but for some assistance, then we say, okay, then you're not in need enough for us. But looking at trying to make sure that we recognize that those are folks that are probably 2 steps away from, that in maybe 2 years when we said no to that eviction assistance, that then now they've been living doubled and tripled up and are really truly showing up at doors of shelters. So I think a recognition of crossing over, and again, I think that's the other piece of my message is that we need to go outside of what we traditionally have been doing. And I'm a homeless service provider and I'm going to do homeless services and I'm going to serve people who are at risk of becoming homeless or currently homeless, looking at how do we serve people? And really, how do we serve people who are in crisis? Whether that's crisis is generally for us is around a housing situation. So I think that the first thing I take away is collaboration and cross-training and looking outside of the silos that we're typically in. I also think that it's an opportunity for us, as we keep talking about economic empowerment and livable wages versus poverty and so forth, is we do have to start to talk about jobs and being creative about what that is. And going outside of what is the traditional kind of sense of you get that 9-to-5 job, whether that's the creation of unique opportunities like social enterprises or urban farming and some other opportunities that can serve both a couple of different, whether it's food, desert areas, and or jobs for folks. We have to recognize that there's great opportunities and very creative solutions to that. I also think that, I can't go back and say it enough that communities are the key to really strengthening families and decreasing family instability, is making communities stronger. How do we make communities stronger? We put jobs in their communities. We increase the quality of the housing that's there. You put food into neighborhoods that might not have food or access to food into that particular neighborhood. And then we get outside of waiting for people to come to us, and we go to you. We go to the person that is in need. And again, that's gonna have us all get outside of the box of the traditional way of wait until you come to see us. But I think that's going to be one of the critical pieces of making sure that the consumer's individual needs are being met where they're at.
Thank you, Tina. And Keith, you have the last word.
Thank you. 2 things, I think, on change and then adding something. I've seen a very unique strategy, and I believe it was from Montgomery County. It was an ad that ran on TV, and it said, you hire, you train, we pay. And I thought to myself, how unique. I think it's the time that the ad ran, for one thing. It was during, 12:30, 1 o'clock. But that sort of thing should be taken out into the community and put on billboards and put on posters and put on the side of trucks, and so that employers and people can see that and collectively want to be a part of that. And then two, I think that I would change how money is given to different community things based on a scorecard. It's no longer okay to give the same money to the same center, to the same organization every single time, and they're not effective in what they're doing. So I believe that if we change the way we give the money on a scorecard and see how this organization is meeting up and solving community issues, solving community needs, and rate them from a 1 to 10. This is an A, this is a C, this is, and no longer give the money to, if you're below a C, you're not effective, but begin to reward the A's and take the A model and kind of put them together. So many times we duplicate a thing. So many people in the community are doing the same thing. Let's all come together under one umbrella to do that same thing. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I want to thank the audience for your indulgence, your attention. It's been a delight. I want you to join me in thanking the panelists. Very insightful. Thank you. And now I'll turn it back over to Tom Kelly. Had a couple Toms in the room.
I'd like to thank all of you as well for attending this afternoon. I'd also like to especially thank Marva for facilitating the group, and give Marva a hand. Now, I don't plan to keep you. I just have a couple of housekeeping things. Couple of reminders. If you didn't sign in when you arrived, please sign in as you leave, simply because we're trying to have an idea of how many people attended the sessions and have some record keeping around that. Also, Ellie, we have 3 sessions remaining. They are next week. We have a session next Monday afternoon, Tuesday afternoon, and then next Thursday afternoon. The topics are on the screen. Monday and Tuesday will be here. Thursday will be in Kettering at the National Composite Center, which is off of Wilmington Avenue. All 3 sessions are late afternoon, so they're 3 to 5:30 sessions. The other reminder I have is that we did videotape the session this morning. We videotaped the session this afternoon. We will continue to videotape all of these sessions. You'll be able to access them after about June 1st. And the website to access them is on the screen here. I would also ask anyone that did fill out a card, if you had a follow-up question, if you have some information you'd like for us to be aware of, please give your completed card to Doris or Elise or Jenny. They have the red baskets here, and they'll collect them as you leave the room. And if you did not get a parking pass, if you still need a parking pass, they also have the parking passes as well to get you out of the garage for free. So thank you again. Thank you on behalf of the Family and Children First Council, Montgomery County, and United Way, as we try to put this partnership together and provide good information that will flow into our strategic planning process that will be occurring from now through about the end of the fall, end of the year, as we continue and develop the process. Thank you very much.